Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if your question doesn't get answered in this video, then go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post. Also, don't forget to post any new questions you have, as well as like all the questions that you want answered, because I generally answer them in order of how many likes they have. So let's jump in. Leo asks, "Hi Matt, I wanted to know what your family was thinking when you initially started AJAT. Were they supportive or against it? Or did they just let you do it? Did you have to convince them of your method? Did you have to justify your behavior spending multiple hours a day listening and reading Japanese? How did they react after they realized you became fluent in Japanese? How did they find out? Did you tell them? Did they hear you? Etc." Yeah, so, when it came to learning Japanese, my parents were in general very supportive, just because for my whole life, whenever I said that I wanted to do something that was, generally considered productive or at least not harmful, then they normally were very encouraging and would help me out doing that. So, when I wanted to skateboard, they took me to the skateboarding shop and bought me my first skateboard, I think. And they would drive me and my friends around to different skate parks and things like that. When I wanted to get lacrosse gear, they did the same thing when I wanted to play lacrosse. And so when I said I wanted to learn Japanese, then of course they were like, okay, cool. Yeah, that sounds nice. I mean, at the very beginning, there was nothing that they could have really done to me to help me out. But when I said that I wanted to transfer into the Japanese class, they're like, okay, cool. I mean, yeah, it's good to be passionate and motivated to study things and learn things. So yeah, sounds good. And so, yeah, and then after my first year of Japanese classes at high school, when I said that I wanted to go to the community college so that I could get even further ahead in Japanese. And then when I went back to complete my second year of high school, I would be able to be in the third year of Japanese classes. And so when that time came around, they paid for me to go to community college and they helped me get all the paperwork and stuff like that. And also when I said that I wanted to study abroad in Japan, they allowed me to take money out of my college fund to pay for that. And they helped me go through all the paperwork and they did like the interviews with me and stuff. So they were totally supportive of me going and studying abroad in Japan. When it came to AJAT in particular, I actually remember the first day that I discovered AJAT, I tried to tell my dad about it. I was like, oh, I found this website where this guy, he mastered Japanese in a year and a half, and it turns out that everything that generally people tend to think about language learning is totally wrong. You have to do it in this super crazy radical way. And I told him about that, and his first reaction was just, that sounds like bullshit. That sounds like a scam. I can almost guarantee you that that's not legit. And he didn't try to stop me from getting into it or whatever, because, for the most part, my parents let me just do whatever I was going to do. And so, my dad, he told me his opinion. His opinion was, yeah, it's probably a scam or just a load of crap. But he let me go and do it. He wasn't going to try to stop me from doing the method. I think in general, my parents kind of were of the opinion that you got to let your kids live and learn. Like, you can't, most kids, they can't learn a lesson just from being told it by their parents. They have to actually go and experience doing the wrong thing and the consequences of that. And through that, they start to discover the right path for themselves. And so I think, my dad just knew, like, if he was going to try to force me to not read some website online, I was going to find a way to do it anyway. I was going to, do it on my phone and do it at school or whatever. And then I was just going to resent him for trying to inhibit me doing what I want to do. So yeah, he just let me go and try to do AJAT anyway. I mean, I don't think he really thought much of it. After that one day where I told him about it and he was like, that's a scam, he probably completely forgot about it and didn't know that I was still into it for a while. When I did first get serious about really executing AJAT, that was around when Katsumoto had come out with the whole silver spoon neutrino thing, which, just in case anybody doesn't know, it was this program that he created where you would pay him $2,000 and then every day he would send you an email with exactly what to do, like a list of instructions, exactly what to do. And if you followed those instructions every day, then you would get fluent in your target language within 2 years or something. He changed around the exact dates and different versions of the product. Yeah, I think he realized it took people longer than he thought. But anyway, back when I first, when this product first came out and I was first learning about it, I was very young and naive. I was like 16 and I was like, oh, awesome. Like, Katsumoto is the god of language learning. He figured out exactly how all this stuff works. And so if I just pay him these $2,000, he's going to give me all the newest secrets and tips and tricks, and he's going to give me this clear, linear path to my goal, and then all my hopes and dreams will come true. And so I actually asked my dad to let me take money out of my college account to pay for Silver Spoon. And to that, he was like, no, I am not letting you waste your college money on that. That's ridiculous. If you want to learn Japanese, I'm sure you'll find a way to do it without spending $2,000. And so for this, I'm very thankful to my dad that, he had the wisdom to know that that would have been an awful decision. In hindsight, I can see, everything that Katsumoto would have told you in the Silver Spoon was already available on the AJAT website for free in the form of table of contents. And if you're the type of person who can't be self-directed in your learning and guide yourself to your goal, Silver Spoon's not going to help you, because you still have to execute the instructions that you get sent every day. It's not like it's going to be a replacement of willpower. You still have to actually open up the email and go and make the cards and do the reps and do the immersion and stuff like that. But anyway, so I guess when it came to that, he was not supportive, but I think that was good. And then when it came to me just wearing headphones around all the time, I mean, it might sound kind of funny, but I think from my parents' point of view, that just seemed like the type of thing that I would do, because I had gone through a bunch of interesting, weird phases, like I was super into pen spinning at one point. I tried to do the Uberman sleep schedule at one point, which is where you sleep 20 minutes every 2 hours for a total of 2 hours of sleep per 24-hour period. That's a story for another day. But I was always doing weird, outlandish stuff, and my parents just kind of knew that was just who I was. And I mean, even from when I was a little kid, I would be doing weird stuff, and just always had a mind of my own. And so, I think when I was like, I'm going to listen to Japanese 24 hours a day, because that's going to get me to fluency as quickly as possible. I think they were like, I mean, that sounds like it would work. Like, if you're trying to learn a language and you listen to the language all the time, I'm sure that's going to help. And they're also just like, yep, that's one of those things that Matt would do. Like, just some crazy thing where you walk around with headphones in your ears all the time. And I also think, I've actually asked my mom about this, and my mom has said that she kind of just thought it was a phase that I was going to go through, because I've gone through many phases, like I said. So I think they were surprised when I kept up with it for as long as I did. And like I said, they were supportive of me actually going to Japan. They let me take money out of my college fund for that. And so, overall, they were supportive, leaning to the side of just being neutral and not really caring and just letting me do whatever I was doing. I mean, even from before I started learning Japanese, my parents weren't keeping a very close eye on me. Like, when I was in my phase where I was doing pen spinning hardcore, I was just in my room by myself for most of my free time, and my parents weren't really coming and checking up on me. I mean, also they went through a divorce, and there was other family issues and stuff like that I think kept them pretty preoccupied. And so I don't really think I was their top priority in a way, and I don't hold that against them, because I understand the circumstances at the time. But I mean, for a lot of when I was doing Japanese, they had their own shit going on, and they weren't keeping that close of an eye on me or my brothers. And so we were just left to do whatever we wanted. And so they didn't really know whether I was listening to Japanese and making flashcards in my room, or pen spinning, or just, learning math. Like, they had no idea what I was doing. And I don't really think they were even thinking about it that much. But they definitely knew that I was very into Japanese, and they'd see me with the headphones. So, I guess they're overall, they were kind of just like, yep, that's Matt being Matt. He wants to get good at Japanese. That's cool. He's going about it in a crazy way. Well, that's a very Matt thing to do. Well, we'll have to wait and see how this turns out. And, when a few years had passed and I had gotten fluent in Japanese, honestly, I don't really think my parents thought that much of it. I think they were kind of just like, well, of course you got really good at Japanese. You spent fucking all day, every day doing that for years. I mean, they knew that I was a competent person. I had gotten good at many other skills. I can play multiple musical instruments and have gotten decent at multiple sports. And so there was no surprise to them that when I completely dedicated myself to learning Japanese, I got good at Japanese. And the thing is, like, I haven't really talked to them that much about the AJAT methodology. I mean, I told my dad about it right at the beginning, right? And when I first discovered AJAT, and he didn't respond to it well. And the other thing is, they just didn't really care. Like, I've tried to talk to my dad about language learning a few times here and there when it's come up in the past few years, and he's not interested in the topic at all. And so, yeah, my dad is kind of the person where, like, if he's not interested in something, he can't really have a conversation about it. He might disagree with that, but from my point of view, that kind of seems like just where he's at. Where if there's like something where he just doesn't give a crap about it, and he's just like, he'll play along with the conversation for like a couple minutes, but you can just tell from his facial expressions and his tone of voice that he's not into it at all, and he's not really going to make a big effort to engage. So he doesn't care about language learning. We've never really talked about language learning theory. Same thing with my mom. I mean, right now I think of me as like a language learning expert just because I have a decently sized online following and I make videos about language learning. But I don't really think they understand my perspective of how most people in the language learning field are misguided and basically don't have that strong of a grasp on how language learning and language acquisition actually happens. And I'm just lucky in that I stumbled across this guy's philosophy that gave me the right types of direct experiences to help me be in a position where I do have a better grasp on how language acquisition actually works. Like, I don't really think they understand that perspective. I think they're just like, yeah, he spent a shit ton of time studying Japanese, and now he's good at Japanese, and now he helps other people learn Japanese on the internet. And that whole aspect of being having some radical ideas or being subscribing to a kind of fringe philosophy within language learning, I don't really think they have really thought about that or realized that. And yeah, they didn't really think it's that cool that I got fluent in Japanese in general, because they're not really into Asian culture. They don't really care. To them, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, it's all the same. So the fact that I got really good at Japanese, like, doesn't really mean that much to them. I think, like, my stepdad actually thinks it's cooler than my parents, because, like, every once in a while, he'll like be watching a movie and something Japanese will come up, or he'll have like some can of soda that has like a Japanese text on it, and he'll be like, "Hey Matt, what does this say? Can you read this?" And I'll like tell him what it says, and he'll be like, "Wow, that's crazy! You can actually read this. It just looks like scribbles to me." And so he thinks it's cool. My brothers think that it's pretty cool, especially the older of my two younger brothers, because he's pretty into anime and just steeped in otaku culture a little bit more. He's into like Japanese video games a lot. And so he definitely thinks it's cool that I know Japanese, and he's even talked about maybe thinking about trying to learn Japanese at some point in the future. And yeah, sometimes when he's watching anime, when he thinks that one of the subs, might not really be accurate, he'll ask me what the exact nuance of the original is and things like that. And so I think my brothers think it's pretty cool. I think for my younger brother, the younger of my two younger brothers, he thinks it's cooler that I have a YouTube channel and I'm just on YouTube and I've made videos with Dogen and Xiaoma. I think he thinks that's cooler than just me being good at Japanese. But he definitely thinks it's like a cool thing that I'm doing. And I think both as well, my parents think it's cooler that I'm starting my own business and doing my own thing and at least making enough money to pay my rent. And living independently. I think they think that is pretty cool, more than that I'm actually like really good at Japanese or whatever. Like, so yeah. But I mean, there have been moments where, we're at a Japanese restaurant and I speak to the waiter and the waiter's really impressed, where even my dad or my mom will be like, "Oh yeah, that is pretty cool. Like, you really speak Japanese, huh? Don't you?" And so, yeah, I still think there's a component where they don't really get it fully, that I'm like actually completely fluent in Japanese. I can think in Japanese. I can have deep conversations about philosophy and read literary works in Japanese, and it's similar to as if I was doing it in English. I don't think they really get that, because I've just never really thought about it, and they don't really care. And so, yeah, I mean, they're not really into language learning, so they can't really empathize with that at all. Like, my dad, he grew up in Canada, and he went to a French immersion school for most of his grade school. So at one point, he was completely fluent in French, to the point where, he could learn math and learn physics in French and things like that. But he moved to the United States when he went to college, and he just stopped using French as soon as he left Canada and ended up completely forgetting it because he didn't use any French. And at this point, he can barely introduce himself, and he doesn't feel bad about that at all. He doesn't care at all. He has no regrets, because to him, it's like, well, why would I care about French? My whole life's in English. Everything I need is in English. So what would be the point of using time and effort to relearn French or keep up French? So he really just has no special respect for foreign languages. And same thing with my mom. She's always been bilingual her whole life, besides like learning a little bit of Spanish in college. And they're totally fine with that. And it kind of makes sense. So I remember like telling my mom, like, oh, I'm going to learn Chinese. And she just being like, why would you want to learn Chinese? And I didn't have anything I could explain to her to get her to empathize with me wanting to learn Chinese. And when I was thinking about learning German, it actually looks like probably I'm not going to learn German. That's also a story for another day. I like told my family at dinner, like, yeah, I was thinking about maybe learning German with Lucas. And they were just like, no reaction at all. They were just like, why would you want to learn German? And so, yeah, they just, language learning is one of those things where either it calls you, you resonate with it, you think it's really cool, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then I don't think you're going to be able to be convinced of that. Especially if you're a native English speaker. You completely take language for granted if you're a native English speaker, because literally everything that you could ever want to do exists in English in abundance. So I think if you grow up really in any country where English isn't the native language, you're going to inherently be able to empathize at least a little bit more with people who want to learn another language, especially learn English. Like most Japanese people can totally understand why someone would want to learn English. Whereas, my parents, it's kind of like, why would you want to learn a language unless you just happen to be, super enamored with the country that speaks that language? So, yeah. I guess I'll move on to the next question now. I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name, so I'm just not going to even pronounce it. If your name's too hard to pronounce, I'm sorry, I'm not even going to make an effort. Hi, Matt. How long did you keep learning 10 to 20 new words a day before you started running out of new vocab to learn? Whenever I pick up a book or anime, I feel like I'm adding a month's worth of new sentences to the backlog, and it can be a bit off-putting to pick up new things until I catch up. I know this will eventually subside as my known Japanese grows, but I'm curious how long it took for you to get to a point where you were encountering less than 10 new things per day in immersion. I'm at about 7,000 bilingual cards and 3,000 monolingual cards. So I think I should make a distinction here between books and non-books, because, well, I'll get into that in a minute, but books just have an unbelievable amount of words and like an unbelievable range of vocabulary used within them. So if we're talking about not books, anything that's not a full-on textbook, even including manga, TV shows, even science fiction TV shows, fantasy TV shows, conversations with friends, blog articles, YouTube comments, YouTube videos, anything on the TV at all, anything that is not a book, I probably got to the point where I would, if I was only immersing myself in non-book type of resources, then I would encounter less than 10 things a day, probably after 3 to 4 years total. I can't really say how many cards it was because I was reading books from the beginning, so I don't know how many of my cards were from books and how many were not from books. But yeah, I would say probably after 3 years, just living in the immersion world outside of books, I would find less than 10 words a day. I'd still find probably maybe around 5 a day, but that after 3 years, it was less than 10. And then after 5 years, which is like similar to where I'm at now in terms of vocabulary, it would be like 0 to 1 word, 1 new word a day outside of bookland. And so like today, if I were just going to talk to some friends in Japanese for a couple hours, watch some TV shows in Japanese, read some manga, play some games, do whatever I want, I would probably come across either 0 or 1 new word per like 10 hours of immersion. But if we're talking about books, most books, to this day, if I was going to take a book off the shelf and sit down and read for like a couple hours, I would probably be able to find enough stuff to make 10 cards to this day. And this is even true for English for me. Like for most English books, if I took an English book off the shelf, as long as it wasn't written for kids, like it's an actual like beefy either fiction or nonfiction book, and I sat down and I really scrutinized, do I know what every word means? I'm pretty sure within a couple hours I'd be able to find 10 words where I don't really know what they mean and I might want to make a card for them. And in my experience, that never goes away because there's just so many words used in books. Now, the thing is, if I were going to take a random novel off my shelf and read it and come across the words I don't know, most of those words, most of my Japanese friends wouldn't know either. Because, when you're reading a book in your native language, there are a lot of words that you don't know, but you generally just skip over them. And what I've found is that the type of people who tend to write books are the type of people who read a shit ton of books. And because they read a shit ton of books, they have a much larger vocabulary than the average person. And then when they go on to write a book, they also use tons of words that the average person might not know. And so because of this, books just tend to have this super wide range of vocabulary, and it really just doesn't really end. Like, I don't know how many more cards I would have to make before I could get to the point where I could read a whole book and find less than 10 things that I know. But yeah, so for the longest time I was learning words with the expectation that it would get to the point where I just learned them all. But the thing is, there are Japanese frequency lists that go up to like over a million words, I think. And this is like including conjugations and things like that. So, it depends on how you count, but there are at least like hundreds of thousands of words. Like there are like over 200,000 words in a lot of Japanese dictionaries. So it makes sense that you're not going to get to the point where you just don't come across new words anymore if you've only made like 10, 20,000 cards, right? That's actually a tiny fraction of all the words that exist. But the thing is, by the time you get to 20,000 cards, you're going to know most of the words that natives know. And of course, you know words outside of just the ones that you learned within your cards. But so, yeah, I find that when I read a book, there's still lots of words I don't know. When I ask my Japanese friends, they don't know them either. So that never really goes away. But the thing is, when you can read for 2 hours and there's only 10 words you don't know total, that's actually not very much at all. And you can easily just ignore those or just look them up on the spot and keep going. And your reading experience itself would not be affected at all. Like, I can read a paper book and, like, let's say that within 2 hours, I can read... Actually, I'd say I'd probably have to read for like 3 hours for most books to find 10 words that I didn't know. So let's say that I read like 50 pages within these 3 hours. And then within those 50 pages, there was a total of 10 things I don't know. So that means like every 5 pages, then there'd be one word I don't know. And when when there's only one word you don't know out of 5 whole pages of text, you can easily infer what the meaning of that word is, or at least infer enough where it doesn't interfere with your understanding, and just keep on going, and it's no problem. And so the fact that there are words I don't know, they don't really affect my reading experience. Like I said, it'd be the same thing in English. Actually, in general, there are more words I don't know when I'm reading in English than when I'm reading in Japanese. And so it's not inhibiting. Now, I eventually just stopped adding these to Anki because it was like, well, first of all, I don't think my life is going to be that improved by having a bigger vocabulary in Japanese past this point, because again, even native speakers don't know these words. If you use these words in conversation, they're not going to understand you or know what you're talking about. And so and even if though I don't know them, it doesn't affect my reading experience. So it's kind of like, what would be the point of learning them? It's kind of a waste of time. Besides just, there's the inherent satisfaction of learning new words and things in the language. And so, yeah, I just stopped adding them to Anki, but they're still there. And so I wouldn't really expect that to go away anytime. So you said that you'd read a book, you'd add, like, I don't know, let's say 100 sentences from that book, and then you're like, well, I haven't learned those 100 sentences, so I don't want to go on to the next book yet. That is a type of thinking that I definitely would recommend dropping, because the better way to think about it is that, yeah, until you get to a really high level where you can literally learn every word that you come across in real time, because it works out to about 10 or 20 a day, then until you get to that point, what's going to happen is that basically you can only learn 10 to 20 words a day, but you're coming across, 30 to 40 words a day. And so instead of just basically learning, like making it so that you are waiting to do new immersion because you haven't learned the 30 to 40 words from the previous book. Instead, you just want to, out of those 30 to 40 words, you want to choose the best 10 to 20 and then just drop the rest. And that way you're constantly doing as much immersion as possible and learning the most highly valued words while you're doing that. And so what I would do personally, like what I actually did, was when I was reading, I would mark sentences that I potentially wanted to add, and I'd later add those all to a text file, and then I would make 10 cards every day, and I'd choose the 10 sentences off the ones in the text file. And I wouldn't be limited to which ones I found in the last day or found in the current book that I was reading. Every once in a while, I'd scroll up to the top of my list of sentences, and I'd make a card out of a sentence that I found in a book that I read 3 books ago, right? And so basically, my list would be constantly getting longer and longer because for the longest time, I would only be learning 10 to 20 words a day, but I'd be finding like 30 to 40 words a day. And so, of course, your total list of things you want to learn just gets longer and longer. And, of course, you later, I would end up having experiences where I'd scroll up to earlier on the list and there'd be words that I already learned, and so I could just remove them. And also, there's just a lot of words in those lists that end up just being garbage because it was super rare and it wouldn't be worth your time to learn it. And so, like, and then, so what I would do is every couple months, I just do a purge where I just delete my whole list of potential sentences that I wanted to learn and just start over. Because eventually there's these sentences where, like, you see them every day, but for whatever reason, you're not drawn to make a card out of it. It just looks like it'd be too difficult or it looks kind of useless. And so you're constantly skipping over it. And then after, like, 2 months of skipping over the same sentences over and over, it's kind of like, okay, well, let's just start fresh and, throw some new juice into this flow. So that's what I would recommend doing. Just learn the best 10 to 20 out of all the sentences you find. Don't worry about learning all of them. That's not going to be possible until you maybe learn another like 5,000, 10,000 sentences. And it also totally depends on what you're reading. Like I said, because like if I'm reading a contemporary novel by an author who I've already read multiple novels from, and in general, it's just Taishu Bungaku, it's like not meant to be that difficult, then I might only find like 5 words a day reading that for 3 hours a day. But if I'm reading a novel from 30 years ago, actually 30 years ago, that's only written in 1990 at this point. If I'm reading a novel that's like 50 to 70 years old, or I'm reading a very dense book on a technical topic, then I might be able to find 30 new words in 1 hour of reading to this day. And I still have that experience because older books use vocabulary that just is not used anymore. So it totally depends on what you're reading. So even for me, there's still situations where I would find more than 10 words to learn in a day. And so, yeah, I wouldn't keep that mindset of like, oh, I haven't learned all the words from book A, so I can't start reading book B. Instead, just assume like, hey, I can only learn 10 words a day. And so if I find 50 words a day in book A that I don't know, well, I'm only going to choose the top 10 of those, and then I'm going to move on to book B, and I'm just going to keep going, because that's going to get you you're going to be learning the same number of words, but then you're just going to be doing more immersion that way, and then the words that you're learning are going to only be the most valuable ones. So that'd be my recommendation. So SC asks, if you can never finish a language, i.e. true 100% comprehension of the language, cultural references, etc., why bother closing the gap from 99% to 99.9%? In other words, what value do you derive from reaching a near-native level versus just fluent? Especially considering you could likely reach 99% in an L3 in the same time it'd take to get the last percent of L2. Coming from someone mainly interested in European languages who tends to get language lust for something new after B2 level. So I think these percentages are, first of all, very arbitrary, and second of all, not very helpful. So if we're actually just going to take your example and say, what's the difference between 99% and 99.9%? Well, let's see, I wrote a little thing out here to help me answer this. So if we say that there's 500 words on a page, if you understand 99%, that means that on that page with 500 words, there's going to be 5 words you don't know. So we're assuming there's 500 words on a page. 99% means that on a single page, there's 5 words you don't know. Whereas 99.9% would be there's only 1 word you don't know every other page. So on average, there'd be 0.5 words you don't know per page. So that's a huge difference. If you're talking about your subjective experience of reading, the difference between there being 1 word you don't know every other page versus 5 words you don't know on every single page, that's like night and day. If there's 5 words you don't know on every page, reading is going to be a slog. It's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to be really slow. You're going to need to have a dictionary there to really continue to follow the plot in most cases. And it's just going to be a constant uphill battle. Whereas if there's 1 word every other page that you don't know, then that's going to be easy reading. You know, you'd be at that point, you'd probably be able to infer the meaning of the unknown word just from context. And so you don't need a dictionary. You don't need to stop. You don't need to rack your brains too much. You could probably just read it similarly to how you'd read in your native language, and it might actually be an enjoyable experience. So if you're talking about those percentages, although on the surface 99 and 99.9 look very similar, when you actually think about it critically, that's a night and day difference. But you said specifically, what's the difference between reaching a near native level and just fluent? And then you said that after you reach a B2 level, which many people consider to be fluent, then you start being tempted to learn a new language. So if we're going to talk about what's the difference between like a B2 level and a C1 or a C2 level, subjectively, the experience is night and day. Like I said, like maybe with the reading example, it would be realistic. Maybe at a B2 level, then you're able to, there's about 5 words you don't know per page. Whereas at a C1 level, there's 1 word every other page. And at a C2 level, it's like every 5 to 10 pages until you find a word you don't know. Which is like what I said in the last question. That's pretty much what my experience is with Japanese and English. And so if you're talking about like, well, let's just first talk about understanding, right? If you're talking about reading a book, like let's say you just want to sit down and read a novel just in order to enjoy it, or you want to read a nonfiction book to actually learn something, your experience of reading a book when you're at a C1 level is going to be an order of magnitude better than if you were at a B2 level, just because the amount of times you have to stop to look something up in the dictionary, the amount of times that you're not understanding something just because language is an issue, the amount of time that there's something referenced that you're unaware of, and so you miss what is trying to be communicated. That's going to happen like 10 times more if you're at a B2 level versus C1 level. And so as a tool, if you're talking about just using a language as a tool, a C1 level of ability is a much better tool than a B2 level of ability. It's like if you use Katsumoto's metaphor of language ability as a knife that you're using to cut things, your knife is way sharper at a C1 or a C2 level, significantly. And so subjectively, that makes a big difference, because for me, I don't want to feel handicapped when I'm studying, when I'm functioning in another language. Like when I was at a B2 level in Japanese, I felt very handicapped when I try to watch something. Like very often I just wouldn't be able to fully make out a word, and so I'd miss the point. I'd have to go back and like read the subtitles, or when I'm reading a book, there would be just stuff I didn't know. I had to look stuff up so much that it wasn't really enjoyable, and it just felt like if I was going to be at a B2 level forever in Japanese, then I don't even know if it would be worth keeping it up, because I felt so handicapped at that B2 level. And that's just understanding. Then we're talking about speaking, it's even more so, right? Like I just don't enjoy the experience of not being able to express myself as well as I would like because I'm limited by language ability, right? It feels like I'm running with ankle weights on, or like I'm trying to I don't know, I can't think of a good analogy right now, but it's just like you're so handicapped that it's just inherently frustrating. Now, it depends on your goals, because I think for a lot of people, they start off learning a new language, and at first you literally can't understand anything, you can't say anything. You get to the point where you can have conversations in the language and you feel like that's a big accomplishment. And that is a big accomplishment, and that is really cool. And so for some people, I can get why they get to the B2 level and they're like, well, I can pretty much do everything. From here on out, it's just grind work to close the gap between where I am now and native level. So why would I want to do that? Instead, I could start with a new language that I know nothing of and get up to that point where I can at least have conversations and do things like that. But from my point of view, a language it's like a marriage, right? If I'm going to learn a language, and put a lot of resources into it, that's something that I'm going to be continuing to spend time with for probably the rest of my life. So like I've committed to spending time with Japanese almost every day for the rest of my life to keep my level of ability. And if I'm going to be spending time with Japanese every single day, then I don't want to have that experience of being handicapped, of having a dull knife that can't cut things very well, of needing to put in lots of time and effort just to understand something relatively basic because I just don't have that next level of vocabulary and comfort and knowledge of the references and the culture and things like that. And so for me, it really just comes down to that of not wanting to feel handicapped, because subjectively the difference between B2 and C1 or C2 is like night and day in terms of what you can do, right? And so, yeah, for me, it makes all the difference. Like, yeah, the numbers can be kind of tricky because you see, 99 versus 99.9. But like I said, you actually put that on into some more concrete data. And then, yeah, that's the difference between 5 words you don't know per page versus 1 word every other page. Then as someone who's going to be spending time every single day in that language, that is immensely valuable, right? And the other thing is that if you're going to be spending, like, you're learning a language because you want to spend time in that language, right? Like, because you want to talk to people in the language, you want to consume content in that language and things like that. So if you're going to be consuming content in the language, you might as well continue to improve anyway. In fact, you're probably going to improve whether you want to or not, as long as you're spending lots of time in that language. And so, like, for me in Japanese, like, I was learning Japanese because for the most part, I felt like Japanese was going to be in a very integral part of my life. I thought that I wanted to live in Japan and live most of my life in Japanese. And so for a certain perspective, it wasn't like, oh, I need to get my level up so that I can do what I want to do. It was more like, well, from here on out, my life is Japanese and that has no end. And so, of course, I'm just going to keep getting better and better because that's what happens when you spend all that time in that language. So that's another kind of perspective that you can come at it with. It's very different than thinking of languages as like baseball cards that you just want to collect and be like, oh, check out my baseball card collection. I have Spanish B2, French B1, Chinese A2, and like have this cool collection, your polyglot collection. Like some people like to do that. And I mean, I think that's totally fine because at the end of the day, if you speak English, learning, the fact that you don't speak another language probably isn't going to limit what you're able to do in your life. And so language learning really just becomes a recreational activity. And I think that's totally fine. It's still a very enriching activity to learn a bunch of languages to like a B2 level. But like, yeah, from that perspective, if you're just thinking of languages as baseball cards for your polyglot collection, then yeah, it seems like a bad deal to take one language all the way to like the C2 level, because in that same amount of time, you could get 3 more languages at like a B2 level. And of course, from someone making a video on the internet of like making a polyglot, check out how cool of a polyglot I am video, it's more impressive for most, it's going to look more impressive to most people to be able to speak like 5 languages at a B2 level than like 2 languages at a C1 level or something like that. And so if that is what languages are to you, kind of this like cool toy that you take out of its box every once in a while when you go on vacation, or when you happen to run across someone in the street who speaks that language, you have a little conversation about everyday stuff, and that's just what language learning is to you, then that's totally fine. But yeah, from my perspective, where a language is something I'm going to have a long-term relationship with, that I'm going to be experiencing the world through, I'm going to be taking in information through that language, I'm going to be expressing myself through that language, then I don't want to feel handicapped at all. I want to have as much control and precision as possible when working through that language. And so for me, it's like, that's whether or not I'm B2 and C1 or C2 it makes all the difference in the world, because that's what's going to determine whether I'm actually willing to spend, a couple hours every single day for the rest of my life in that language, because I'm not going to do that if I feel handicapped. So yeah, I feel like I repeated myself a lot, but hey, these are mostly off the cuff rants. So what can you do? One sec. Okay, so Renfred asks, do you have any guidelines on how to evaluate yourself when repping audio cards? There are some situations when I have trouble knowing if a rep was effective or not, or was effective, or if I should fail the card. There are 3 specific situations that come up often. There are times when I hear the first part of a sentence and immediately know what the target word on the back of the card is before it's even said, because I've memorized something in the audio and associated it with the word. 2. I'll hear the entire sentence and not understand it, but after listening to it 1 or 2 more times using the repeat audio button, I understand it perfectly. 3. I'll hear the entire sentence and not understand it, but after taking some time to think and sort of replay the audio in my head, I will understand it. I usually pass cards when these come up, but I know that if that sentence came up in a native conversation, I would not have understood it. I guess I'm not sure if the goal of audio cards is to understand it perfectly and instantly on the first try, which happens for many cards I have, or if it's okay to take more time with them, like with text cards. So personally, I would recommend like totally changing the paradigm with which you think about grading cards in Anki. And I've talked about this before, but I guess a lot of people still haven't heard me express these ideas. So I think the mindset that a lot of people come at Anki with is the same mindset that you'd come at like a test at school with. When you're taking a test at school, your goal, so to speak, is to get 100% on the test, because then you're going to get a good grade on your report card, and that's going to be good in the future for various reasons. And so when you're taking a test in school, right, it's like you either get a question right or wrong. You're either going to get a point for that question, or you're going to lose a point for that question. And so people think, well, Anki is kind of like a test. You're testing yourself. And so therefore, I have to have some kind of criteria at which I either am succeeding or failing. But I don't really think this is useful when you think about like what is actually happening with Anki and why are we using Anki. We're not using Anki because we want to get a good report card, right? That no one sees our Anki stats but us. And so whether or not we have a good report card doesn't really change anything ultimately. And the other thing is what's actually happening in Anki when you press good versus if you press fail. Well, I'm going to assume that you're using low-key Anki because I think that that's an overall upgrade to Anki's algorithm, and I recommend that everyone use it if you're using Anki for language learning. So in low-key Anki, there are no ease factors, and so the only thing that happens when you press good on a card is the frequency with which you see that card is going to decrease. You're going to see the card less often. And when you press again, the only thing that happens is the frequency with which you see that card increases. So really, the criteria you should be using when you're grading your cards is the answer to the question, am I going to personally benefit from seeing this card more often or not? Because that's what's really happening, right? The question shouldn't be like, do I know this well enough to pass some arbitrary criteria where I can give myself an A+ on this card? That doesn't really matter in any practical sense, right? All that really matters is, if I see this card more often, is that going to practically help me with my language learning? And so one other kind of like proxy criteria for this is, like you said if this word came up in a conversation, then I don't think I would have understood it. Well, in that case, you probably want to learn that word a little better, which probably means you want to see it more often, which means that you should hit again so that you can see it more often, increase the strength of your memory. That's really what we're talking about, right? Like, it doesn't matter whether you understood the sentence as a whole if you personally know that if that word came up in a book or in a conversation, you wouldn't understand it. Because that's all that really matters, right? Like what really matters is we're trying to understand native content. So that might be a good way to think about it, is if this word came up in native content, would I be able to understand it? If the answer is no, then you don't know that word well enough and you probably want to fail it. It doesn't really matter whether or not you understood the sentence. Now, the reason why I specifically worded the criteria as would you benefit from seeing this card more often is that sometimes you might not understand something, but you still might realize that even if you saw a certain card more often, your understanding of it wouldn't increase. Because sometimes you realize that a card that you thought was I+1 when you initially added it turns out to have not been I+1. And this happens because, like, for example, maybe there's a certain word that you know, and you know one meaning of this word. And so you think you understand the sentence as a whole. But then later on, you realize that that same word actually has two possible meanings, and you can't tell whether it's meaning A or meaning B. And now you can think of because of that, two interpretations of the original sentence, and you don't know which one it is. So weird things like this can happen where you previously thought you understood something, and then as the result of improving at the language, you realize that you actually don't understand something. And it's not that you understood it before and you lost your understanding. It's that you had a false understanding. You didn't really for sure know what it meant. And now you have become aware of that. So in that situation, it might be like, oh, well, I don't understand this sentence fully, but seeing it more often isn't going to fix this issue, because the issue is I don't have enough familiarity with this word. And the only way I'm going to gain that familiarity that I need is through seeing this word in multiple contexts in my immersion. Simply seeing the same card over and over again isn't going to help me increase my understanding of that particular sentence. So even though you don't understand it that well, you still might choose to just grade the card good because you say, well, right now at this specific point in time, seeing this card more often is not going to benefit me. So I'm not going to waste my time with it. I'm just going to mark it good. And then there's also the reverse scenario, like I said, where you technically get the card right because you have the sentence memorized, but you just feel like the memory isn't that fresh. It's iffier whether you're going to recognize this word in the wild or not. So you just hit again because you feel like you're going to benefit from seeing it more often. So I can go through your three scenarios that you brought up. But yeah, in general, I just want to say the real question at every time you're grading a card should be, am I going to benefit from seeing it more often or am I not? Because you don't want to do any redundant reviewing. That's going to be a waste of time and that's going to slow you down. So you're going to say, is seeing this card more often going to be worth the price of the time that it's going to cost to review this card more often? And if yes, then fail it. And it doesn't really matter what your retention rate is ultimately. Because again, it's not like there is some god of language learning who's going to give you a language learning report card. And if your retention rate is below a certain amount, then you're going to fail the class. It doesn't matter. No one sees your retention rate but you. And so it really doesn't matter. And also, retention rate has a lot to do with whatever your interval modifier setting happens to be. So you can fail cards. You can basically lower your threshold for failing a card, so you're failing cards more often, but then turn down the interval modifier, and your retention rate can still go up. So retention rate is not really something I would worry about that much. It's more, instead, I would just use your retention rate as a proxy of how you should be setting your interval modifier and adjusting your interval modifier over time. And instead, just be asking that question when you review, am I going to benefit from seeing this card more? Am I going to be able to understand more of my immersion going forward by seeing this card more often in the short term? If the answer is yes, then you should fail the card. If not, then grade it well. But let's go over your specific criteria. So there are times when I hear the first part of a sentence and immediately know the target word on the back of the card before it's even said, because I've memorized something in the audio and associated with that word. So this, you can't say for sure yes or no. It depends on how well you feel that you know that word. If you feel like, yes, I knew what the word was before I even heard it because I just memorized the sound of the particular sentence on this audio card, but I still just feel like I'm comfortable enough with this word where if it came up in the wild tomorrow in a show I'm watching, I would know it. In that case, grade it good. If you feel like, no, I don't know this word that well, if it came up in my immersion, I wouldn't get it. I only knew what this sentence meant because I memorized it. I memorized the whole sentence, then you would want to hit again. So the second one is, I'll hear the entire sentence and not understand it, but after listening to it one or two more times using the repeat audio button, I understand it perfectly. So in this situation, probably most of the time you would want to hit again on the card, because if after hearing it a few times, your understanding increases, this means that there probably is benefit to be gained by viewing the card more frequently, because you could potentially get to the point where you understand it the first time that you hear it. So that would be a case where, yes, seeing it more often is going to benefit you, so you want to hit again. And then you say, I'll hear the entire sentence and not understand it, but after taking some time to think and sort of replay the audio in my head, I will understand it. So this might be a time where it's just not really truly I+1. If you have to think super deeply about it to really get what it means, then it's probably I+1.5 or I+2. And you probably don't want to waste your time thinking about it more, because it's better to spend that time consuming stuff that's actually I+1 and finding low-hanging fruit, because that's what's going to grow your ability more. So in that case, you might just hit good, even though that it's kind of iffy. And Eventually, there will come a point where it shows up in your reviews and it is I+1. And then at that point, you might say, oh, now I'm going to fail this card because now I'm at a point where seeing this more often would actually benefit me because I can integrate the knowledge contained within the card. So that's generally how I would think about it. But again, you have to think about it on a case-by-case basis. And also take all of this with a kind of grain of salt. And remember, don't be a perfectionist with your reps. Might be a good idea to go and rewatch my video called The Role of the SRS, where I talk about how ultimately you're never going to be able to master words from the SRS alone. The main job of the SRS is just to create dictionary entries. It's really while you're immersing that you gain a nuanced understanding of what these words mean and really consolidate and acquire them fully. So don't be a perfectionist. Don't be failing everything left and right because you're like, oh, technically I could know this a little bit better, because you don't want to waste too much time reviewing in the SRS. But in general, I would say that's the framework I would use, as long as you don't get too OCD about it. So Phoenix asks, I have a question regarding MorphMan and its current buggy state in Anki 2.1. Do you have any intention of adopting and or updating or expanding MorphMan in the future? The MorphMan port hasn't been updated since January, and as it is, the add-on is buggy and crashes on launch. And although this specific bug is a simple fix, trying to use the updated version of Unidic, the Gendaigo Hanashikotoba, downloaded off their official website is not. Second, since MorphMan has changed since your last tutorial regarding the initial setup of it and Unidic, will you make an updated tutorial to adjust to these settings? Updating Unidic to this year's current version seems like a must, since it's still using the Unidic from 2016, but setting it up was very confusing. By the way, it's raining very hard outside. I don't know if you can hear it or not. Sorry if that's annoying. But who knows, maybe it's adding a nice sort of ambient white noise to the video. So first of all, there is a version of MorphMan out that works just fine with all of the MI add-ons. You can find it in the MI Discord server if you go to the development section and you go to public releases. There's a version of MorphMan that we have linked there to download that works on Anki 2.1.22, which is the current stable version of Anki that is being used in the current MI add-ons development cycle. So it's going to work with all the other MI add-ons, and it works just fine. So that's the first thing. But we are not really planning on continuing to update or expand MorphMan, because MorphMan is just a really awful piece of software. It's very poorly designed. It's very poorly structured. It doesn't work well at all. And it just seems to be never-ending trouble. And the thing is, because we didn't... Well, first of all, if we wanted to really move forward with something like MorphMan is in such bad shape, it'd probably be better for us to just create something from scratch, from the ground up, rather than trying to fix this thing that's kind of fundamentally broken. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is just that MorphMan, since we didn't create it, we don't have total control over it. Anyone can add to it and change it. And we've been realizing more and more that trying to incorporate things that are not within our control, within our kind of recommended protocol, is inherently problematic. Because right now, right, anyone can go and just change MorphMan and change it on the GitHub or whatever. And now, suddenly, our guide on the MI website is out of date. And so now I have this responsibility of every time some random person goes and changes MorphMan, I have to stop what I'm doing and go and update my guide, otherwise our guide is out of date. And this was a similar problem like we're having with just the Anki updates, right? Where Anki would just get a new update and it would break a bunch of the MI add-ons. And now we have to stop what we're doing, stop working on our new projects, and then go and spend time to change the add-ons, update the add-ons so they work on the newest version of Anki. And so now this big thing that's outside of our control, which is Anki releases, like Anki version releases, has the ability to just mess up our schedule and mess up our workflow. So that's why we decided to create these development cycles where for a 6-month period of time, we're going to make all of our add-ons for a certain version of Anki. And by doing this, now we don't have this issue where something outside of our control can come along and just stomp on our schedule. And so basically the problem with MorphMan is it's a similar type of thing. MorphMan is not in our control. And so now people can update it, add weird, esoteric, unintuitive features, and add features that break it and all these other things, and it didn't work that well in the first place. So the idea of trying to like continue to have MorphMan be a part of the official MIA protocol is just a really bad idea, and so we don't really plan on doing that. Now the tricky thing is, I have kind of popularized MorphMan within the community, and this I think is a mistake. I regret doing this. Basically what happened was I had a friend who got into MorphMan, and he told me how it worked, and he kind of explained to me how it had the potential to really improve workflow when it came to using Anki to learn from immersion. And in theory, the idea is really great. It's a really solid idea that has a lot of potential. The problem is that the execution is just done so poorly with the specific program MorphMan. And so I was so excited about the idea when I first learned about it that I started making videos about it and talking about it before I had enough experience with the particular program to realize how poorly the execution had been done. And if I could go back in time, instead of popularizing MorphMan, I probably would have just waited and we would have just made our own thing and it would have been a lot better. But there's this issue now where MorphMan already exists and it's already very popular. A lot of people already rely on it. So I kind of can't just pretend that I never talked about it and just pretend that it doesn't exist anymore, right? And so that's why we have made sure that there is a version that exists right now that works with all the add-ons. You can, like I said, you can find it in the MI Discord server. But going forward, we want to cut ties with MorphMan as soon as possible because this is just dragging us down. And it reflects poorly on MIA for us to be recommending a piece of software that is so convoluted and works so poorly, right? We don't want people coming into MI saying, hey, what is this MI thing? What's going on here? Checking it out and realizing like, oh, so part of what you guys are telling us to do is use this super crappy convoluted piece of software? I don't know how I feel about that. And so, yeah, it reflects poorly on MI and we want to get rid of it as soon as possible. Now, whether or not we will fully create a replacement for it for Anki, that has not fully been determined, and there are also some bigger plans that we have that we're currently in the process of working on that I can't fully divulge yet because too many of the details are unknown. But in the future, no matter how things play out, it's eventually going to get to a point where everything that you want to be able to do, you're going to be able to do, and you're going to be able to do it with just tools that we have provided and that we have made sure work very well. There's many different potential ways that the specifics of this could show up, but I will say that. So at some point you will have the functionality of MorphMan in some way, shape, or form in a way that works well, but it's not going to be called MorphMan and it's not going to be something that evolves out of the current version of MorphMan now. So what I would say is if you are really attached to MorphMan, you really like it, then there is a version that works now, but in the long term, it's going to be up to you and other programmers outside of us at MIA to continue evolving it and making sure that it works, fixing out all the bugs and dealing with all the inadequacies of it as a piece of software. And I apologize for popularizing it and then eventually going back and saying like, well, actually, no, we're not gonna continue to support it, basically. But yeah, personally, I stopped using MorphMan for all my language learning because it works so poorly, and I don't think it adds as much because it works so poorly. I don't think it adds as much value as it kind of seemed like it would in theory. But yeah, sorry for the vagueness in some of the end of that answer. You'll see with time why it has to be that way. So I Am Me asks, are you dissatisfied with your uses for Japanese? What media you enjoy? The people you interact with? With knowing what you would get out of Japanese now, would you have liked to learn a different language instead? So am I dissatisfied with my uses for Japanese? No, not at all. Japanese has given me so much. Like, the thing you gotta keep in mind is that at the end of the day, language learning is about the journey, not about the destination. And first of all, I had an epic journey learning Japanese that taught me so many things about life, so many things about myself, grew me so much as a person, expanded my horizons so significantly that I wouldn't really, it would be hard to trade it for anything in the world. Now, of course, I can speculate on, hey, well, maybe if I would have learned programming instead, that would have taken my life in a totally different, really interesting direction and would have grown me in other ways. Or maybe like, hey, maybe even if I learned Chinese instead of Japanese, that would have grown me in some other way. But I mean, the reality of the situation is when I was 16 and I got into Japanese, the language I wanted to learn was Japanese. And I had no interest in any other language. And so really thinking about like, oh, I wish I would have learned Chinese instead. It's like, well, I didn't give a crap about Chinese when I was 16, like at all. I couldn't empathize with people who wanted to learn Chinese at all back then. And so, like, it's like, what's the point of saying, oh, yeah, I wish I learned Chinese? It's like, well, there was no reality where that was even on the table. So, it's like kind of pointless to think about. And the other thing is like, you can think about, well, should I have done something outside of learning Japanese? It's like, well, when I was 16, due to how my life unfolded, what I wanted to do was learn Japanese. I thought I wanted to go to Japan and live as a Japanese person. And so that's what the reality was. That was what I wanted to do. So it's like, I can't really trade that for anything else because that's how things were when I was 16. That was what I wanted to do. So if you could have gone, like, even if me from the future could go back in time and try to talk my 16-year-old self into learning another language or into doing something else, I don't think I would have listened. I think I would have been like, screw you. Japan is awesome. It's where my future lies, and no matter what you say, I am going to follow my dream and I'm going to go to Japan. So like that was kind of like that was how things are. So I mean, my journey, first of all, it couldn't have been anything else given the circumstances. But even outside of that, like my Japanese journey gave me so much. And that's just the journey itself, right? And now we're talking about the present moment. It's like, well, because I learned Japanese really hardcore for all those years, now I get to be Matt vs. Japan. And that's like pretty dope. Like I get to talk to people like Dogen and Shauma. I get to appear on their videos. I get to talk to them as equals. And I get to have an audience of people listening to me. I get to be in a position where I am paying all my bills, just doing my own thing, not beholden to anyone else's standards or obligations or anything else. We are designing MI exactly how we want it to be, and we're making a living doing that. So that's like totally awesome. When you think about all the other things I could be doing, like I could just be working for some company doing something I don't want to do, or I could have some deadbeat job, or like of all the other possibilities, this possibility is like pretty dope. So it's hard for me to say like I'm dissatisfied with what Japanese gave me, because Japanese has given me so much, right? Like if I would have learned like a couple like Spanish, French, and German to a really good level, it's like, well, there's a bunch of polyglots who are pretty good at French, German, and Spanish, and so it wouldn't have been a big deal. I wouldn't have been able to make this type of career out of it if I was in that position, right? It's through learning Japanese and mastering Japanese. I mean, of course, there's no such thing as mastering, but getting to where I got with Japanese, that allowed me to be in this position, allowed me to be someone who like Dogen views as an equal and will allow to be on his channel and things like that. And so I'm so grateful for all these things that Japanese gave me. Also, because Japanese is so difficult and I tried to get so good at it, it forced me to really hone my views on language learning and to really figure out how language acquisition works. Because if you're trying to learn French or German, like you can use crappy methods and still pretty much get all the way to native like fluency. And so it doesn't force you to figure out language acquisition to the same extent that learning an Asian language does, because it's just literally harder. It's like the game is just harder when you're learning an Asian language. And so if you want to still get the highest score possible, you got to hone your methods and you got to find out what really works and what doesn't, and exactly what the mechanisms are. And so, yeah, I think learning Japanese and trying to get to the highest level possible is totally crucial for me being in the position where I can provide as much value as I do to the language acquisition community. And so even though that, yeah, I don't really care about watching anime anymore, I don't really care about like being able to talk to Japanese people that much anymore, like the very specifics of like what I do with Japanese, like I don't really care about anymore. That doesn't bother me at all. I don't feel dissatisfied about that, because Japanese has given me so much in terms of just as a person. It's given so much to my life. provided me with so many opportunities and got me to such a cool position at such a relatively early point in my life. So yeah, I don't really think I would trade it for anything. And I don't feel dissatisfied at all. I'm just so thankful for all the things that Japanese has given me. And yeah, it's like there was a time where I was more salty that Japanese comedy isn't funny and Japanese TV shows are corny and everything is better in English. But like I kind of just got over that, and it doesn't really bother me anymore. I just take that as a given, and I try to focus on how much cool stuff Japanese has provided to my life. And I still get a kick out of knowing Japanese itself, you know, like I still have friends I talk to in Japanese. I still feel like Japanese gives me a different perspective to think about things, and has helped me gain more flexibility in my thinking. So there's still a lot of cool things that this specific that you know the specific fact of knowing Japanese outside of what it's provided to my life as a whole. Like just the fact that I know Japanese has definitely given me value in a direct way, but yeah, overall it's more about where Japanese has allowed me to go with my life. So yeah, that was all for this week. Thanks so much for supporting. Cool stuff will be coming in the future, and good luck with your immersion.